I was in a class at college, and a friend of mine across a desk across the aisle was doodling in his notebook little comic book characters and stuff and superheroes, and we got to talking about comic books. And I said, yeah, I'd been a big fan of Superman and Green Lantern and stuff when I was a kid, but I told him I gave up my comic books and my baseball cards and other kid stuff. I gave them to my brother when I went off to college. The next class, he brought in a comic book and he threw it on my desk and he said, read that and tell me it's kid stuff. And it was Conan the Barbarian #4, the Tower of the Elephant issue. And I got hooked on it. The first page just pulled me right into it. And I said, well, okay, this is pretty good. And so I read a few more Conan comics, and then I wanted to know, well, where did these stories come from? I wanted to read the original stories. And so I managed to find some of the Lancer paperbacks and read some of those stories and kept on going. I first joined the Robert E. Howard United Press Association in 1981 and started meeting up with people, talking with and corresponding with people who really knew a lot about Robert E. Howard. And I had been enjoying the stories mainly because they were good adventure stories along the lines of Tarzan and so forth. And I started corresponding with these other people who were telling me things that about other stories that Howard had written and things about Howard himself. And one of the things that really quickly had been coming to me was when I would read the introductions to the Conan books, and then I would read the Conan stories, it seemed to me that the writer that was being talked about in the introduction couldn't be the kind of person who had written those stories. So I got interested in finding out more about who this guy was that had started writing these stories. And through all of that and meeting people and learning more about it, I just kind of got hooked on learning more about Robert E. Howard. When my company transferred me to Houston in 1985, I was talking with a friend and we said, well, why don't we why didn't he fly to Houston and join me and we'd drive up to Cross Plains and see Howard's house, see where Howard was from. And we did, and I thought, wow, what an imagination this guy had to construct these fantasy worlds in the environs that he did. Wouldn't it be great if other Howard fans could come and see this place and see what kind of a staggering imagination he must have had to be able to visualize these places when he's in the midst of this environment. And my friend sort of scoffed and said, well, who's going to come to the middle of nowhere? Well, the next year, a bunch of people in REHupan had said, yeah, I'll come. So we brought a van load of people here, and the library folks, Joan McCowan and Billy Ruth Loving and those folks, really put on the dog for us. They put on the welcome. And we just kind of got hooked into the people and the place and coming back to Cross Plains, and we decided to come back another time, and it just kind of snowballed from there. I started coming up frequently from Houston to find people who had known Howard or knew about Cross Plains during the time that the Howards lived here, so I could learn more about him and his environment and how he grew up. And that has been just an ongoing process, and in the process, of course, made really good friends here. And so I keep coming back as much to see my friends in Cross Plains as to see other Howard fans, because to see other Robert E. Howard fans, you could meet them at a convention that was someplace more accessible. But these folks here in Cross Plains have just become really good friends. And I wrote a piece a couple of years ago for the benefit book that Dennis McHaney published that I called Hometown of My Heart. And Cross Plains really has become the hometown of my heart. It's not where I grew up, but it's kind of where I wish I'd grown up. Your first impression when you come here, at least my first impression when I came here in 1986, was that the place was kind of desolate. I had grown up in East Tennessee where the vegetation's lush. You got all kinds of greenery and undergrowth, and it's just lush and almost semi-tropical. And so when you come here, you think, man, this place is close to a desert. But if you get out, I know probably the first time that really grabbed me was when I made a little side trip down to Lake Brownwood State Park and did the little hiking trail, and was walking along and thinking, you know, if you had just enough imagination, that hill could be a 10,000-foot Afghan mountain, and El Borak could be scrambling behind those rocks trying to get away from the Jazail bullets. And if you had just enough imagination, that little cleft between those rocks, that where it looks like animals go down to the lake, that could be Picts sneaking through the woods. They're one of their little trails through the woods. And I started to appreciate how much there was around here that an imagination like Robert E. Howard's could have taken and really done something with. I think there's some of Texas in just about everything he wrote. And some people say, oh, you know, he was writing about universal themes and stuff. Of course he was. Great writers do that. But he was himself thoroughly imbued with Central West Texas. In his letters, you kind of see the growth of almost his awareness of that. From of course, the 20-year-old young man who's wishing like heck he could get the hell out of town, to the 30-year-old who's saying, you know, these things have, I think he uses the phrase that it seeps into your soul. And he really was so thoroughly imbued with Texas that there's nothing that he wrote that doesn't have a little of that in it. Texan attitudes, the Texas environment, the Texan realization that nature is not exactly benign, that sometimes nature is trying to kill you. They have incredible storms, and you know, even a little thing like you say, well, okay, Conan, he said Conan is a man of gigantic melancholies and gigantic mirths. And then you look at the weather here and you say the weather sometimes is balmy and wonderful and sunny, and then the next day a tornado's going to come ripping through and tear up everything you've done, or hailstones are going to beat up your crops. So he gets a sense of the violence of the world, of the violence of the natural world, and I think that contributes to his sense of the violence of humanity as a part of the natural world. So you see little bits like that. The more you study, the more you read and visit Texas and see where he was coming from and where he was living, the more you can see that in his writing too, and how it influenced his writing. Well, you have two major struggles. One is popular culture generally is not accorded literary significance. So Edgar Rice Burroughs is not considered a significant writer, and science fiction writers have a tough time being accepted, and fantasy writers and so forth. So you have that struggle built in already, where popular literature has a tough time being accepted. Then you've got, secondarily for Howard, I think, another tough hurdle is the violence. I think literary types are a little squeamish about extreme violence sometimes. Although I think, you know, you've got writers like Cormac McCarthy out there that are accepted. And Howard's certainly no more violent than Cormac McCarthy. So I think the day is coming that we're going to see more. Well, we're seeing the Library of America published Lovecraft and Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. So the popular culture writers are starting to work their way into the literary canon, but it'll be a little while. I think Howard's main theme is the violence that's within us. That we are only a thin veneer is our civilization. You know, his famous quote, barbarism is the natural state of mankind, civilization is the whim of circumstance. Barbarism will always ultimately triumph. To me, what that means is civilization's hard work. We have to try hard to be civilized. And when that trying hard ceases, when we get into conflicts, when the natural world turns against us and we're on our own, we revert to the barbarism. We revert to the violence that's really, in essence, at our core. It's, in a way, his theme of one of his poems is titled "Never Beyond the Beast." And I think that's the ultimate theme in Howard, is that we really have to work hard to not revert to that inner savage core that we have. Oh yes, and his friend Lindsay Tyson, everybody testified that he could be fun company, or he could be moody and sullen sometimes, but he could be really great company. And in one interview, Lindsay Tyson had said that Bob would frequently keep his friends in stitches. They'd just be rolling in laughter from stories that he would tell, or jokes that he would tell, or whatever. So, and you read, people are familiar mainly with his, quote, sword and sorcery type stories, Conan and Kull, and his horror stories and so forth, but at least half of his fiction output was funny stories. It was the funny westerns, the boxing stories and so forth. And those, actually, the Steve Costigan boxing stories and the Breckinridge Elkins humorous western stories were his two most commercially successful series, along with Conan was the third one. Those were the most successful series he sold during his lifetime. Well, as Lovecraft famously said, Howard put himself into every one of his stories. And I'd have to say not every single one. All the ones that Lovecraft had read, you start digging into the trunk that he left behind of unsold stuff, and there's a little bit of weak stuff there where you could tell his heart really wasn't in it. But for the stuff that was published, for the stuff that he intended to be published, he's really in there, and you can feel that sort of passion for the storytelling. But as far as telling a wide variety of stories, he had to do that to make a living. Because in the pulp era, the magazines were tremendously specialized. So you had pulps that published just Western stories, and pulps that published just boxing stories and just detective stories. And in order to make a living, you had to be able to write for a lot of these different pulps. And so or you had to be able to come up with one character that you could write about over and over and over and over again that would click, a Doc Savage or a Tarzan. And Howard's problem was that because it was him in there, he was writing about his own ideas, his own feelings, his own passions. Well, he couldn't write about the same character all the time. He would say what he had to say about that character, but then he would not be able to write about them anymore. He'd have to move on to a new character. So he had to be able to splash a lot of different pulps, particularly in the early part of the Depression, when some of the magazines that he was selling to either folded or started falling way behind in their payments. That's when he finally took on an agent. He had been mostly selling his stuff on his own, but he took on an agent in 1933, and he started trying to splash the field and sell to a lot of different kinds of pulps. But even his detective stuff, which he hated writing. He said he couldn't stand to write one or read one, but even while they're not great detective stories, no mystery fan is going to be fooled by what's going on. They're still great Howard adventure stories. He couldn't write a lame story. They were never unexciting, no. I mean, it's really hard to imagine Raymond Chandler or Dashiell Hammett with his detective ending up going up against the alien hordes with a battle axe, like Howard had Steve Harrison doing at the end of Lord of the Dead. But that was Howard. He loved writing adventure stuff, and so even the detective stories would turn into that.